On the morning of October 17, 2019, a park maintenance worker named Elias Morno reported what he believed to be a deceased hiker lying face down just off the Blue Ridge Spur Trail in northern Colorado. A narrow stretch of switchbacks that cut through pine forest and shale slopes roughly 4 miles from the nearest ranger station. And at first, nothing about the scene appeared unusual beyond the stillness of the body. The way the man's left arm was twisted beneath his chest, as if he had slipped while descending, the dirt pressed into his cheek, and the faint drag marks in the loose gravel that responders assumed were caused by animals during the night. But what immediately unsettled the first deputy on scene was the absence of blood, broken bones, or visible trauma, because while hypothermia was common in that elevation during autumn, the weather logs showed mild overnight temperatures and no rain, and the man was dressed appropriately with thermal layers and hiking boots that still carried fresh mud, suggesting he had been moving not long before he died. The victim was identified by a wallet in his pack as 32-year-old Daniel Reeves, a software engineer from Fort Collins, who had texted his sister the previous afternoon saying he planned a short sunset hike before driving home, and phone records confirmed his device lost signal just after 7:40 in the evening, which aligned with the time the sun dropped behind the ridge line. And investigators initially treated the case as an unfortunate medical emergency, possibly cardiac or neurological, until the coroner's preliminary report indicated that Daniel's lungs contained fine forest debris, pine needles, and soil particles consistent with inhalation over several hours, which contradicted the idea of a sudden collapse because the material suggested he had been breathing while close to the ground for an extended period, something that should have caused extreme distress long before unconsciousness. What shifted the investigation from routine to deeply unsettling was a discovery made later that afternoon when a ranger named Claire Henson remembered that a motion-activated wildlife camera had been installed overlooking that section of trail as part of a mountain lion tracking project, positioned on a tree roughly 20 feet uphill from where the body was found. And when the memory card was retrieved and reviewed at the station, officers expected to see nothing more than passing deer, or maybe Daniel walking by earlier that evening. But what they saw instead was a 6-hour sequence of time-lapse images taken every 60 seconds beginning shortly after 8 o'clock. And in the first frame, Daniel was visible far down the trail, standing upright and facing away from the camera as if he had stopped to look at something in the woods. And in the second frame, 1 minute later, he was on his knees, his posture stiff and unnatural. And by the third frame, his body was pitched forward onto his hands. And over the next several hours, he continued to move, but not in any recognizable way of a person crawling to safety or attempting to rise. Instead, he advanced inch by inch in jerking increments, his limbs bending at wrong angles, sometimes pausing completely for long stretches, sometimes shifting sideways as though dragged by something unseen, always facing downward, never once lifting his head toward the trail ahead. The most disturbing detail was that Daniel did not appear to be injured in any of the frames. There was no blood trail, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. And yet his progress toward the exact location where his body would later be discovered was steady and deliberate, almost like a mechanical repositioning rather than voluntary movement. And when timestamps were overlaid, the footage revealed that from 8:15 in the evening until just after 2:30 in the morning, Daniel had traveled roughly 37 feet, a distance that should have taken seconds under normal circumstances, but instead unfolded in a slow, unnatural crawl that resembled something learning how to use a human body rather than a man desperately trying to survive. Investigators noted long periods where Daniel did not move at all, sometimes remaining frozen for 20 or 30 minutes before shifting abruptly by several inches. And during one particularly unsettling stretch around midnight, his right arm lifted slightly off the ground, bent backward at the elbow, and then lowered again in a way that medical experts later described as inconsistent with conscious motor control, more like a post-mortem spasm than a living reflex. Yet Daniel's lungs indicated continued breathing during that time, meaning he was somehow alive through most of the sequence despite the body behaving as if basic neurological function had failed. When the footage reached 2:47 in the morning, Daniel's body arrived precisely at the spot where it would later be found, his chest settling into the dirt, his head turning slightly to the side. And then for the remaining 2 hours of recording until dawn, he did not move at all, not a finger twitch, not a breath detectable by chest motion, just complete stillness. And the coroner later estimated his time of death between 3 and 4 in the morning, aligning almost exactly with when the movement stopped, which suggested that whatever had been animating his body for hours simply ceased, leaving him where it had placed him like an object carefully arranged, rather than a victim who collapsed. As news of the footage spread quietly among law enforcement and wildlife officials, attempts were made to find a rational explanation, including the possibility of severe neurological episodes, rare parasitic infections, exposure to toxins, or even a staged hoax, but none could account for the precise directional movement, the lack of injuries, the prolonged breathing while face down in dirt, or the mechanical consistency of the crawl. And toxicology reports returned clean, showing no drugs, no alcohol, and no environmental poisons in Daniel's system, while autopsy imaging revealed mild bruising on the knees, forearms, and ribs consistent with prolonged ground contact, not with falls or trauma, reinforcing the idea that he had indeed been pressing himself against the earth for hours. Search teams scoured the surrounding forest for signs of an animal attack, human interference, or terrain hazards, but found nothing beyond Daniel's initial boot prints where he had stopped walking normally near the trail bend. And from that point onward, there were no clear tracks, only faint, disturbed gravel where his body had shifted, as though his weight had been redistributed rather than stepped forward, and no other footprints were discovered near him, meaning no person had approached him, helped him, or moved him during the night, leaving the footage as the only record of how he traveled those 37 feet. One ranger later reported that when they reviewed the time lapse at full speed, compressing the 6 hours into under a minute, the motion looked even less human, Daniel's body gliding in sudden lurches like a malfunctioning puppet, occasionally rotating slightly before correcting its direction, always oriented toward the final resting place as if guided by an unseen path. And in one sped-up segment, a shadow appeared briefly along the tree line, stretching unnaturally long across the ground despite no recorded wildlife triggering the camera, though experts cautioned it could have been a lighting artifact from passing clouds. Yet no clouds were logged in the weather reports that night. The case grew quieter as months passed without answers, and officials ultimately ruled Daniel's death as undetermined, citing unexplained neurological failure combined with environmental factors. But the footage was never released publicly, only described in vague terms during internal briefings, until a technician who had transferred departments anonymously leaked still frames to an online forum, where they circulated briefly before being removed, though not before viewers pointed out something investigators had initially overlooked, which was that in the earliest frames Daniel's shadow fell naturally behind him, but as the night progressed and the crawl continued, the shadow no longer aligned with the moon's documented position, sometimes appearing slightly ahead of his body, sometimes splitting into two faint outlines, as if light were being blocked by something not fully visible on camera. The final unsettling revelation emerged during a second review nearly a year later, when a digital enhancement specialist was asked to clean up the darker portions of the footage for archival purposes. And when contrast was increased around Daniel's form, faint distortions could be seen surrounding his torso and legs, subtle warping in the air like heat ripples rising off asphalt. And within those distortions appeared brief shapes that did not match foliage movement, resembling elongated impressions where something pressed close against him, not pulling, not pushing, but almost wearing his body like a layer, adjusting limbs in small increments, repositioning him over time with methodical patience. What ultimately haunted the investigators most was a detail that only became apparent when the timestamps were compared to Daniel's phone data. Because although his phone lost signal just after 7:40 in the evening, its internal motion sensor continued logging subtle activity until nearly 2 in the morning, registering tiny repetitive shifts consistent not with walking or crawling, but with something repeatedly lifting and setting portions of his body down, like careful handling rather than effort-driven movement. And then abruptly the sensor activity stopped, matching the exact moment his body went still in the footage. In the end, the official file closed with no criminal findings, no medical cause, and no environmental explanation. Yet among rangers, the story became something spoken about only in low voices, especially by those who worked night patrols near the Blue Ridge Spur Trail, because several later reported hearing slow, dragging sounds in the gravel long after midnight when no hikers were present. A faint, uneven scrape followed by long silences, as if something were moving carefully, patiently, across the ground. And one ranger claimed that when he shined his flashlight down the empty trail during one of these incidents, he briefly saw disturbed dirt forming a shallow groove that ended abruptly in undisturbed forest floor, as though whatever had been traveling there simply lifted away. The most chilling theory, never written in any report but shared quietly between those who had watched the footage too many times, was that Daniel had not crawled to his death at all, but had been slowly positioned after something inside him stopped functioning normally, and that the hours of movement were not a man struggling to live, but a body being carried out of the woods in the only way something unseen could manage, 1 inch at a time, until it reached a place where it could let go and leave him behind. And if that was true, then the most disturbing part was not that Daniel moved after he should have been incapacitated, but that whatever guided him knew exactly where to put him, as though the trail was not a random endpoint, but a chosen drop point, a place where bodies were meant to be found, which raised the quiet, unspoken question that still lingers among those familiar with the case, of how many other hikers who vanished in those mountains might not have collapsed where they died, but were slowly, carefully, and deliberately brought out of the forest while no one was watching,